A Veil and an Iron Mask. Chapter 1. The Veiled Viper. The Great Desert of Izdihar was a merciless ocean of crushed gold, baking beneath a sun that felt more like a blacksmith's anvil than a star. Heat shimmered in the distance, distorting the dunes into undulating waves of mirage. To the untrained eye, it was a wasteland of death. To me, it was a hunting ground. I lay flat against the crest of a sweeping dune, the abrasive sand seeping through the woven linen of my garments. The fabric of my veil, a deep, bruised purple, clung to the lower half of my face, fluttering violently in the arid wind. I am Aisha, though the terrified merchants and weeping nobles of this stolen land knew me only as the Veiled Viper. I was 19 years old, and my heart was a hardened stone of vengeance. Below us, crawling through the valley of dunes like a bloated, glittering centipede, was a caravan. "They are heavy, Saida," murmured Tariq, his voice barely rising above the whistle of the wind. He was my second in command, a boy no older than myself, yet his eyes carried the ancient exhaustion of our people. Silks, spices, perhaps even gold from the eastern reaches. I narrowed my eyes against the glare. The caravan was massive, a procession of groaning camels and ornate, enclosed carriages lumbering toward the grand entrance of the Izdihari capital. It looked like a merchant's dream returning from the Silk Route. The guards walking alongside the beasts seemed lethargic, sweltering in the midday heat, their spears dipping lazily toward the sand. "Too heavy," I whispered, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine, "and too careless." But I looked back at the 20 faces pressing into the sand behind me, the cinnamon birds, my family. They were thin, their eyes hollowed by the harsh life of the desert, their clothes patched and repatched. They were the exiled children of Al-Hudud, a kingdom swallowed whole by the Izdihari war machine 5 years ago. We needed the coin. We needed the supplies. If we let this prize slip into the capital, we would starve before the moon turned. "We take them," I commanded, my voice slicing through the wind with absolute authority. "Standard flanking maneuver. Nobody dies unless they force our hand. We are thieves, not butchers." Tariq nodded, signaling down the line. We moved as one, a silent, deadly shadow detaching from the dune. We descended upon them like a sudden sandstorm. With a piercing ululation that echoed off the dunes, the cinnamon birds crested the hills on all sides. We rode down on our agile desert mares, our swords drawn, catching the sun in blinding flashes of steel. The caravan guard shouted in sudden, panicked disarray, camels brayed, thrashing against their reins. I rode at the vanguard, my black mare, Midnight, kicking up a storm of dust. I drew my scimitar, the curved blade humming a familiar, deadly song. We encircled them in a matter of seconds, tightening the noose until the entire caravan was trapped in a ring of leveled spears and drawn swords. "Drop your weapons!" Tariq roared, his horse prancing nervously. "By the grace of the Veiled Viper, surrender your cargo and keep your lives." A few of the guards dropped their spears immediately, raising their hands to the sky, but the thrill of the ambush soured in my throat. Something was wrong. The panic was too thin. The disarray felt rehearsed. My gaze snapped to the front of the caravan, settling on the lead rider. He sat atop a massive, coal-black stallion that dwarfed my own mount. He wore a heavy, charcoal-gray cloak that draped over his broad shoulders, seemingly impervious to the suffocating heat. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't shouted. He simply sat there, watching me with a stillness that made my blood run cold. I rode toward him, keeping my sword raised. "Are you the master of this caravan?" I demanded, my voice ringing out, muffled slightly by my veil but dripping with aristocratic pride I had never truly unlearned. The man did not answer. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a gauntleted hand. He snapped his fingers. The sound was surprisingly sharp, cracking like a whip over the terrified braying of the camels. Instantly, the world shifted. The sides of the ornate, enclosed carriages collapsed outward with a deafening crash of splintering wood. From within the supposed cargo holds, a terrifying sea of polished armor and drawn steel erupted. The merchants and guards simultaneously threw off their loose robes, revealing the crimson and gold tunics of the elite Izdihari royal infantry. We were outnumbered 5-1 in the blink of an eye. "Trap!" Tariq screamed, pulling his horse around, but a wall of heavy shields had already formed, cutting off our escape route to the dunes. I spurred my horse forward, fury igniting in my veins. "Fight them!" I cried, though I knew it was a hopeless command. I would not be taken. I would not let them parade me in chains. I launched myself from my saddle, my scimitar leading the way, aiming straight for the cloaked man who had orchestrated our doom. I landed gracefully on the sand, rolling to absorb the impact, and sprang to my feet. The man finally moved. He swung down from his stallion with terrifying, fluid grace. As his boots hit the sand, his heavy cloak caught the wind and billowed back. A collective gasp rippled through the cinnamon birds. He wasn't just a commander. He was a monster out of our darkest tavern tales. His face was entirely obscured by an intimidating, masterfully forged iron mask. It was a cruel thing, shaped into a permanent, snarling visage of a demon, heavily engraved with Izdihari runes of war. I had heard the whispers. Everyone had. This was Khalid, the bastard son of the Sultan, the Iron Prince. Rumor said he had been fighting on the blood-soaked eastern fronts for years, sent there by a father who wished him dead. Rumor said the mask hid a face so horribly disfigured by battle that grown men wept at the sight of it. Rumor said he had returned to the capital only months ago to crush the rebellion and secure the borders, and I had just ambushed him. "Surrender, veiled viper." His voice resonated from behind the iron mask. It was deep, rough like grinding stones, carrying a chilling lack of emotion. "I'd rather choke on this sand," I spat, tightening my grip on my hilt. "I attacked. I was fast, trained by the finest sword masters of Al-Hudud before my kingdom fell. I moved like water, launching a flurry of strikes, a high arc, a low sweep, a thrust aimed for the joints of his armor. He didn't just parry, he absorbed my momentum. He moved with a brutal, terrifying economy of motion. Our blades clashed, the sound ringing out over the silent, watching armies. Sparks flew as my scimitar slid against his heavy broadsword. I gritted my teeth, spinning to deliver a roundhouse strike to his ribs, but he wasn't there. He sidestepped with impossible speed for a man wearing so much armor. Before I could recover my balance, the flat of his blade slammed hard against my wrist. My hand went entirely numb. The scimitar flew from my grasp, embedding itself point first into the sand. Instantly, a heavy, iron-clad forearm smashed into my chest, knocking the wind from my lungs and sending me sprawling to my knees. Before I could even draw a breath, the cold, razor-sharp edge of his broadsword was pressed firmly against the bare skin of my throat, just beneath my veil. "I am a man of profound impatience," Khalid said, his mask looming over me, eclipsing the sun. He didn't even sound winded. "If your birds do not drop their weapons this instant, I will separate your head from your shoulders." "No." I rasped against the blade. "Fight. Run." But my cinnamon birds were not soldiers. They were family. Tariq threw his sword into the sand with a curse of despair. One by one, the clatter of dropped steel echoed across the dunes. They surrendered. For me. Pride turned to ash in my mouth. I glared up at the emotionless iron demon, hatred burning so bright it blurred my vision. "Bind them," the Iron Prince commanded, not moving his blade from my throat until heavy iron chains were secured around my wrists. We returned to the capital. Chapter 2. The Iron Mask. I expected the spectacle. I expected to be dragged through the sun-baked, bustling streets of the capital, pelted with rotting fruit and the jeers of the Izdihari citizens. I braced myself for the humiliation, holding my chin high despite the heavy chains dragging at my wrists. But the spectacle never came. Instead of parading us through the grand gates, the royal guard blindfolded us. We were shoved into the back of heavily reinforced wagons, the scent of hay and old wood suffocating in the heat. The ride was rough, the wheels clattering over cobblestones for what felt like hours. We were being smuggled into the city like contraband. When the blindfold was finally ripped from my eyes, I found myself alone. They had separated me from the cinnamon birds. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in my chest. I rushed the heavy wooden door of my cell, slamming my fists against the iron grating. "Tariq! Amina! Where are they? What have you done with my people?" Only silence answered me. I spun around, taking in my prison. It was strange. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a small, windowless stone room, but the floor was covered in a rich, woven rug. There was a basin of fresh water, a platter of dates and bread, and a cot laden with soft silk cushions. It smelled of jasmine and burning frankincense, not urine and despair. I paced the room like a caged tigress. This made no sense. Why hide us? Why treat the notorious veiled viper to a room fit for a minor noble? Hours bled into one another. I refused to touch the food, suspecting poison. I sat on the edge of the cot, my knees pulled to my chest, my mind spinning through 100 desperate plans of escape. The heavy thunk of a bolt sliding back shattered the silence. I leaped to my feet, my muscles tensing, ready to fight with my bare hands. The door swung open, and he stepped inside. The Iron Prince. He was alone. He closed the door behind him, plunging us into the dim light of the single lantern hanging from the ceiling. Without his heavy cloak and armor, dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored tunic of dark indigo, I could see the sheer, intimidating breadth of his shoulders and the lean, predatory grace of his build. But the mask remained, that horrifying metal demon staring back at me. "Where are my people?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. "They are safe, fed, unharmed," he replied, his voice still that grating, emotionless rasp. "For now. What do you want, monster?" I spat, taking a step toward him. "Why? The secrecy. Is the great bastard prince afraid to show his prizes to the city? Or are you just afraid they'll look at your face and vomit in the streets?" I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to pierce that impregnable armor. "I've heard the stories, Khalid. They say you're more beast than man under that iron. That your father's enemies carved you like a roasted pig. Tell me, do you sleep in the mask to avoid scaring yourself in the dark?" He stood perfectly still, letting my venom wash over him. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. His fingers found the clasps at the back of his head. With a metallic click, the bindings released. He pulled the heavy iron mask away and let it drop to the carpeted floor with a muffled thud. The insult died on my lips. My breath caught in my throat, all the air suddenly sucked from the small room. I had prepared myself for melted flesh, for a missing eye or a nose cleaved in two. I had prepared for a monster. Instead, I was staring at the most breathtakingly handsome man I had ever seen. He was young, perhaps only 3 or 4 years older than me. His skin was the color of warm bronze, smooth and unblemished by the horrific ravages of war I had imagined. He had a strong, aristocratic jawline, high, sharp cheekbones, and lips that were full but pressed into a grim, stoic line. His hair was a shock of thick, dark waves, slightly damp with sweat from the mask. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed me. They were a piercing, luminous amber, framed by thick, dark lashes. They were the eyes of a hawk, intelligent, deeply sorrowful, and terrifyingly cold. There were no massive, disfiguring scars, only a single, thin, silver line, a small cut slicing diagonally through his right eyebrow. I stared at that scar. A strange, phantom memory tugged at the edges of my mind. A flash of a marble courtyard, a boy bleeding, a shout. The memory slipped away before I could grasp it, leaving behind a profound sense of confusion. "Speechless, veiled viper?" Khalid asked. Without the mask, his voice was entirely different. It was no longer a metallic rasp, but a deep, smooth baritone that vibrated right through the soles of my feet. It was a voice made for reciting poetry in dark, silk-draped rooms, not commanding armies. "You," I stammered, completely thrown off balance. I pulled my veil up slightly, a sudden, foolish urge to hide myself washing over me. "You're not disfigured. Disappointment is a bitter pill," he said dryly, stepping further into the room. He towered over me, his presence suffocatingly intense. "My brothers find the rumors of my hideousness comforting. My father finds it convenient. I find it useful. Fear is a far more effective shield than iron. Aisha al-Sharif." My blood turned to ice. My real name, spoken aloud for the first time in 5 years. I stepped back, my spine hitting the cold stone wall. How? Khalid's amber eyes pinned me in place. "Because I make it my business to know everything in this wretched kingdom. I know that 5 years ago, when my father's generals sacked Al-Hudud, the 14-year-old princess gathered the survivors and fled into the treacherous dunes. I know the cinnamon birds are not mere bandits, but refugees, your people." He stepped closer. The scent of him, sandalwood, leather, and a sharp tang of ozone enveloped me. "I also know," he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate murmur, "that if the Sultan discovers your identity, he will not just execute you, he will torture every single one of your people in the public square to make an example of Al-Hudud's defiance." "Then do it!" I yelled, tears of absolute rage and terror pricking my eyes. "Turn us in! Collect your father's praise like the good little lapdog you are!" Khalid's expression didn't change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "I have no intention of turning you in, princess. I have a proposition for you." I barked a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "A proposition from the Iron Prince to the exiled princess? I will pardon you. I will grant your people safe passage, gold to rebuild, and a pardon signed with the royal seal. In exchange, you will do something for me." And what could the Sultan's greatest weapon possibly need from a thief? Khalid looked away, staring at the flickering lantern light. For a fraction of a second, the stoic veneer cracked. An expression of such profound, acidic hatred twisted his beautiful features that I actually shrank back. "You will pretend to be my bride," Khalid said softly, returning his gaze to mine. "My foolish, vapid trophy wife, and together we are going to assassinate my father and my 2 brothers." The silence in the room was absolute. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the treason he had just casually uttered. You want to kill the Sultan, I whispered. Your own blood. They share my blood. They are not my family. If you kill them, I reasoned, my mind racing through the political implications, you become the sole heir. You assume power over the entire nation of Izdihar, over my conquered home. I looked into his amber eyes, searching for the tyrant. What happens then? What do you plan to do when you have absolute power? Khalid stepped back, his broad shoulders rising as he took a deep breath. His face hardened, returning to the impenetrable mask of stone. If it were entirely up to me, he murmured, a terrifyingly cold smile playing on his lips, I would sit on the throne and watch it all burn to ash. A genuine shiver of fear racked my body. He wasn't joking. He was entirely serious. But, Khalid continued, his voice flattening out to a businesslike tone, I will decide what to do with the ashes when the time comes. For now, I am only interested in the mission. Do we have a deal, Aisha? Your life and the lives of your people, for your sword and your deception. He held out a large, calloused hand. I looked at it. I thought of Tariq, of the starving children hidden in the desert canyons. I looked at the man who possessed the face of a god and the heart of a ruin. I reached out and placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and dangerous. We have a deal, I said. Chapter 3. The Feast of Vultures. The transformation was agonizing. For 3 days, I was scrubbed, perfumed, and polished by a cadre of silent handmaidens who asked no questions. The calluses on my hands from years of sword fighting were filed down. My sun-darkened skin was oiled with jasmine and rose. The rough linen of the desert was traded for garments so exquisite they felt like spun air. I stared at myself in the gilded bronze mirror. I wore a gown of midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver threads that mimicked the starry sky. Sapphires rested heavy against my collarbones. My dark hair, usually braided tight to keep out the sand, fell in loose, shining cascades down my back. Even my veil had been replaced. It was now a sheer, glittering wisp of silver organza that hid nothing, serving only to frame my face. I looked like a princess again. I looked like prey. It suits you, a deep voice rumbled from the doorway. I turned. Khalid stood there. He was dressed in ceremonial armor, dark steel etched with silver filigree, a crimson sash tied at his waist, and upon his face rested a new mask. This one was elegant, covering only the upper half of his face like a masquerade piece, forged from polished silver. It hid his eyes in shadow but left his strong jaw and those maddeningly expressive lips visible. It feels like a shroud, I replied coldly. Play the part well tonight, and it will be a weapon. He offered his arm. My brothers are arriving. The Sultan is away on diplomatic business, which gives us the perfect opportunity to announce our engagement. I rested my hand lightly on his forearm. Through the silk of my dress and the steel of his bracer, I could feel the coiled tension in his muscles. We walked through the palace, a sprawling labyrinth of white marble, trickling fountains, and arches decorated in dizzying mosaics. It was beautiful, but it smelled of blood and stolen wealth. We entered the grand banquet hall. The sheer opulence was nauseating. Mountains of roasted meats, towers of glazed fruits, and fountains of sweet wine dominated the center of the room. Nobles lounged on silk cushions, laughing and gossiping. The moment we walked in, a hush fell over the room. All eyes darted to Khalid, then to me. I could hear the whispers buzzing like locusts. The Iron Prince, a bride. Who is she? How did she stomach his face? Smile, Khalid murmured, his lips barely moving. Look at me, as if I am the sun. I forced a brilliant, blinding smile, gazing up at his silver mask. I fluttered my eyelashes. "Oh, my fierce prince," I cooed loudly enough for the nearest nobles to hear. "The music is so wonderful." I felt him stiffen slightly in amusement or annoyance. I couldn't tell. We made our way to the head table, where two men were already seated. These were the legitimate heirs. My targets. Omar, the eldest, was a mountain of a man, his flesh spilling over the sides of his ornate chair. His face was slick with sweat and grease from the roasted lamb he was aggressively tearing apart with his bare hands. His eyes were small, piggish, and instantly roved over my body with sickening entitlement. Beside him sat Hassan. He was a stark contrast, tall, impossibly skinny, with a face like a hatchet. His movements were precise, nervous, and his dark eyes burned with a malicious, calculating intelligence. "Ah!" Omar boomed, wiping his greasy hands on his silk tunic. "The conquering bastard returns!" And he brought a pet. Omar laughed at his own joke, spraying crumbs. Hassan merely smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. Khalid did not react. He pulled a chair out for me, seating me with infuriatingly perfect chivalry before sitting down himself. "Omar, Hassan, I present Aisha. She is the daughter of a wealthy merchant from the southern coasts. We are to be married." "A merchant's daughter?" Hassan sneered, taking a delicate sip of wine. "How pedestrian. But I suppose a man with your afflictions, little brother, must take what he can get." I gripped the silk of my dress under the table to stop myself from reaching for a dining knife. I looked at the two brothers. It struck me as bizarre. They mocked his disfigurement. Yet looking at them, I realized they genuinely believed the rumors. They don't know, I realized with a shock. His own brothers don't know what his actual face looks like. "She is certainly a beauty," Omar slurred, leaning heavily over the table, his fetid breath washing over me. He reached out a thick, sausage-like finger. "Tell me, sweet thing, does he wear the iron in bed, or do you just close your eyes and pretend he's a real man?" Before I could formulate a vapid response, Omar's hand darted forward, his fingers hooking under the edge of Khalid's silver mask, intending to rip it off. Lightning fast, Khalid's hand shot up. He grabbed Omar's thick wrist. The silence at the table was sudden and absolute. I watched, fascinated and slightly terrified, as Khalid's grip tightened. He didn't say a word. He didn't even shift in his seat. But the muscles in his forearm corded like iron cables. Omar's piggish eyes widened. His face flushed a dark, mottled purple. A soft, high-pitched whine escaped his throat as the bones in his wrist audibly ground together. He tried to pull back, but he was trapped in a vice. Hassan half rose from his seat, alarm flashing in his eyes. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. If Khalid broke the crown prince's arm in front of the entire court, our plan was dead before it began. I had to act. I let out a high, drunken giggle, slumping sideways into Khalid's shoulder. "Oh, my mighty prince," I slurred loudly, wrapping both my arms heavily around his arm, the one holding Omar. I pressed my chest against him, looking up with wide, foe-adoring eyes. "Please, don't crush your poor brother. You promised me a dance. You promised." Khalid looked down at me. From behind the silver mask, those amber eyes burned into mine. For a long, breathless moment, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, the tension bled from his arm. He released Omar's wrist. Omar snatched his hand back, cradling it against his chest, panting heavily, his eyes full of venomous fear. "My apologies, brother," Khalid said, his voice smooth and deadly. "I am unaccustomed to courtly touches. My reflexes are calibrated for the battlefield." He stood up, effortlessly pulling me to my feet with him. My bride wishes to dance. Chapter 4. The Edge of a Blade. The feast eventually ended, a blur of sycophantic nobles and too sweet wine. I had played the part perfectly, giggling, hanging off Khalid's arm, acting every bit the brainless beauty enamored by a monster. But when the heavy oak doors of Khalid's private chambers closed behind us, the charade shattered. The room was vast, draped in heavy crimson velvets and dark woods. A massive bed dominated the center, covered in a fortune of silk sheets. A cool breeze drifted in from an open balcony overlooking the sprawling, moonlit city of Izdihar. Khalid reached up, unclasped the silver mask, and tossed it onto a table. He ran a hand through his dark hair, suddenly looking exhausted. Without a word, I reached into the hidden slit of my silk gown, strapped to my thigh. My fingers found the familiar, comforting grip of a small, wickedly sharp silver dagger I had stolen from the banquet table. I spun around and closed the distance between us in 3 rapid steps. Before he could react, I slammed him back against one of the heavy wooden pillars supporting the canopy bed, bringing the dagger up and pressing the flat of the blade directly against his throat. Khalid didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. He simply looked down at me, his amber eyes calm and unreadable. "We need to establish boundaries," I hissed, my chest heaving, the adrenaline of the night finally spilling over. "I am your partner in this treason, Khalid. I am not your whore. You will not touch me. We will not share that bed. If you try, I swear by the sands of Al-Hudud, I will open your throat while you sleep." He stared at me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, his expression completely blank, he took a step forward. I gasped. He moved so suddenly, pushing himself forward, driving his own neck directly against the sharp edge of my blade. A tiny bead of blood bloomed on his bronze skin, right above the collar of his tunic. Instinctively, to prevent slitting his throat and dooming myself and the cinnamon birds, I stepped back. I didn't lower the blade, but I yielded the ground. He took another step. I stepped back again. My shoulders hit the cold stone wall of the chamber. I was trapped. Khalid didn't stop. He stepped into my space, closing the gap until his large body was pressing flush against mine. The heat radiating off him was immense. The smell of sandalwood and sweat clouded my senses. He leaned down, his face coming so close to mine that I could feel the ghost of his breath against my lips. My heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. The blade was trapped horizontally between our chests, pressing dangerously into his neck and my collarbone. "You are a fierce little viper," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shockwave down my spine. "But you are foolish." His eyes dropped to my lips. It was a microscopic movement, but in the electrified air between us, it felt like an earthquake. A sudden, terrifying jolt of pure desire pierced through my anger. We were enemies. He was the son of the man who destroyed my life. Yet, pressed against him in the dark, staring into those golden eyes, I realized with absolute horror that the only thing stopping us from kissing was the thin piece of silver between us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. Khalid's gaze flicked back up to my eyes. The stoic mask returned. He reached his left hand over my shoulder. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to snap my neck. Instead, his hand bypassed me entirely, plunging into a silver bowl resting on a table just behind my head. He pulled back, holding a bright green apple. He took a casual bite. "I prefer sleeping in the open air," he said, chewing slowly, his voice entirely devoid of the tension that was currently turning my blood to lava. He stepped back, instantly shattering the suffocating intimacy. The sudden loss of his body heat left me shivering. He walked toward the open balcony doors. "Keep your dagger, princess. You'll need it. Meet me in the courtyard before dawn. Wear common clothes." He stepped out onto the balcony and vanished into the night, leaving me alone, gasping for air against the wall, my hand trembling so hard I dropped the dagger to the floor. Chapter 5. The Mad Honey. The city of Izdihar was entirely different in the pale blue light of dawn. The stifling heat had not yet risen, and the streets were filled with the quiet bustle of bakers, merchants, and laborers starting their day. I walked beside Khalid. He wore a simple, rough-spun brown tunic and loose trousers, a drab woolen cloak thrown over his shoulders. I wore a modest gray dress, my hair braided simply, a plain linen veil covering only my hair and neck, leaving my face exposed. And Khalid's face was exposed too. It was surreal. We walked through the crowded bazaar, pushing past people who would throw themselves on the ground if they knew who was bumping into them. The great Iron Prince, the monster of the East, was buying flatbread and haggling over the price of figs. Nobody looked twice at him, because nobody knew. "It's brilliant," I murmured, tearing off a piece of the warm bread he handed me. "A prince who is a ghost in his own kingdom. The mask is your cage, but it's also your greatest freedom." Khalid looked at me, a ghost of a genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. It made him look devastatingly young. "It is the only time I am simply a man, the only time nobody expects me to kill or be killed." We navigated the winding, spice-scented alleyways until we reached a small, dilapidated apothecary tucked away in the shadow of the city wall. The bell chimed as we entered. The air inside was thick with the smell of dried herbs, sulfur, and sweet decay. An old man with eyes clouded by cataracts shuffled out from the back. When he saw Khalid, his wrinkled face broke into a massive, toothless grin. "Ah, the wanderer returns," the old man croaked. "I have it, just as you requested a moon ago." The man reached under the counter and pulled out a small, sealed clay jar. Khalid placed a heavy gold coin on the counter, too much for whatever was in the jar. "My thanks, Yusuf." When we were back on the street, I eyed the jar. "What is that?" Khalid held it up to the light. The clay was slightly warm to the touch. "It is a rare delicacy from the high mountains of the north, a reddish-brown syrup. It is a gift." "A gift?" Khalid's eyes darkened, the easy demeanor of the marketplace vanishing. "A gift for my sweet-toothed brother, Omar. They call it mad honey, gathered from bees that feed exclusively on toxic rhododendron flowers." I understood immediately. "Poison?" "Not entirely. In small doses, it is intoxicating. In large doses, it causes severe hallucinations, madness, and an uncontrollable surge of adrenaline." Khalid tucked the jar into his cloak. "Omar loves chocolate. He loves his pleasures. And tomorrow is the day before our wedding. He will be feeling celebratory." The plan was falling into place. It was ruthless. It was perfect. Chapter 6. The Fall of the Boar. The afternoon sun was bleeding red across the marble floors of the palace when the royal guards knocked on my chamber door. "Lady Aisha," the guard announced, refusing to meet my eyes. "Prince Omar requests your presence in his private gardens. He wishes to present you with a pre-wedding gift." I smoothed the skirts of my emerald green silk gown. I had painted my lips a deep crimson and lined my eyes heavily with kohl. I looked every bit the seductress. I glanced around the room. Khalid was nowhere to be seen. He had made himself scarce, as planned, to ensure Omar felt emboldened. "Lead the way," I said softly. As I followed the two guards down the long, echoing corridors, I kept my eyes peeled. We passed an alcove where a third guard was stationed. As we walked by, I caught his eye, flashed a brilliant, conspiratorial smile, and winked. I discreetly tapped the right side of my chest. The guard looked down, his eyes widening in faux panic. He hurriedly rubbed at a small dark stain on his tunic, a stain that looked remarkably like dried blood. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. It was Tariq. The cinnamon birds had infiltrated the palace staff, slipping into the rolls Khalid had quietly emptied for them. My heart swelled with fierce pride. We were inside the belly of the beast. Omar's private gardens were a decadent oasis of flowering vines, caged songbirds, and plush silk divans. Omar was lounging on a massive settee, sweating profusely despite the shade, wearing a sheer silk robe that left far too much of his bulk exposed. "Ah, the beautiful bride," he purred as I entered, waving the guards away. "Come, sit with me, little bird." I forced my revulsion down, locking it in an iron box deep in my chest. I pasted on a coy, glittering smile and glided over to him, settling onto the cushion beside his feet. "You honor me, Prince Omar," I murmured, batting my eyelashes. "My brother is a fool," Omar sneered, reaching out to stroke a lock of my hair. I had to force myself not to flinch from his greasy touch. "He is a scarred monster who knows only mud and blood. You are meant for silk, for jewels, for power." "Power is very attractive," I whispered, leaning in slightly. Just then, a servant approached, keeping his head bowed low. Another cinnamon bird. He carried a silver tray, bearing an ornate gold plate, piled high with rich, dark chocolates. "Ah, perfect," Omar grunted, taking a massive handful of the chocolates. "Have one, my dear. Brought all the way from the Western Isles." "Oh, I couldn't," I demurred, putting a delicate hand to my stomach. "I must fit into my wedding gown tomorrow. But please, you enjoy them. You look so strong. You must need the energy." Omar puffed out his chest, utterly failing to look dignified. He shoved 3 chocolates into his mouth at once, chewing loudly. The mad honey. Khalid had laced the entire batch. I sat there for 20 agonizing minutes, playing the sycophant, laughing at his terrible jokes, marveling at his boastful lies, all while encouraging him to eat, and eat he did. He consumed the entire plate. Slowly, a change came over him. He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. Sweat began to pour down his face in rivers. He blinked rapidly, rubbing his eyes. "Is the sun? Is it too bright?" he muttered, his voice suddenly sounding thick and slurred. "It is quite pleasant, my prince," I said softly. Omar stood up abruptly, swaying on his feet. He looked at the caged songbirds. "Why are they screaming?" He roared suddenly, clapping his hands over his ears. "Stop the screaming! The demons! They have fire in their mouths!" The mad honey was taking effect. The hallucinations had begun. He whirled around to face me, his piggish eyes blown wide, the pupils dilated to black pits. But he didn't see me. He saw whatever horrors the toxin was feeding him. "You!" he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. He lunged at me, his massive, meaty hands reaching for my throat. "You brought them here, you witch!" I moved faster than him. I ducked under his clumsy grab, pivoting on my heel. My hand shot out, grabbing a heavy, solid gold jewelry box resting on a nearby table. Using my momentum, I swung it in a vicious arc, slamming it directly against his temple. The hollow thunk was sickening. Omar's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the marble floor like a felled tree, unconscious. I stood over him, my chest heaving. I placed the jewelry box back precisely where I found it. Then, I sat back down on the divan. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Omar began to twitch. He groaned, thrashing his head from side to side. The honey was still in his system, trapping him in a nightmare. I reached into a small pouch at my waist and pulled out a vial of sharp-smelling salts. I cracked it under his nose. Omar jolted awake with a blood-curdling scream. He scrambled backward like a crab, his eyes fixed on thin air, screaming about shadowy beasts and burning flesh. It was time to perform. I ripped the sleeve of my own gown, let out a piercing, terrified shriek, and bolted for the garden doors. "Help! Guards! Help me!" I screamed, bursting out into the corridor, tears of manufactured terror streaming down my face. I collapsed into the arms of the first guard who arrived. "The prince! He's gone mad! He tried to kill me! He's fighting shadows!" A crowd of servants and guards rushed to the garden entrance. Inside, Omar had drawn his ceremonial sword. He was spinning in circles, hacking at the air, screaming incoherently. The adrenaline surge from the honey gave him terrifying strength. He smashed the bird cages. He shattered the fountains. "Die, demons! Die!" he roared. He spun, his eyes locking onto the expansive, open balcony that overlooked the palace cliffs. In his mind, it must have been an escape route, or perhaps another enemy. He charged forward with a battle cry, not slowing down for a second. The guards yelled out, reaching for him, but they were too late. Omar vaulted over the low marble balustrade. He didn't even scream as he fell. The sickening crack of his impact on the stone courtyard several stories below echoed up the cliffs. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing loudly, hiding the cold, triumphant smile spreading across my lips. One brother down. Chapter 7. Shadows and Scars. The palace was in uproar. The oldest prince was dead, a victim of sudden, tragic madness. Hassan, the second son, immediately seized control of the palace guard, demanding answers, searching for assassins. But there was no poison to be found in the cups, no wounds on the body save the fall. Khalid and I stayed in the periphery, playing the shocked, grieving family members. Hassan had quickly dispatched a fast rider to find the sultan, who was still 2 days away. Night fell over Izdihar, thick and oppressive. I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline of the kill still buzzed in my veins. I threw on a dark robe and wandered out into the labyrinthine hallways of the palace, seeking the cool air of the courtyards. The corridors were eerily quiet, too quiet. I turned a corner into a long, moonlit colonnade and stopped dead. Blocking my path at both ends were a dozen elite royal knights. They wore heavy plate armor, their faces obscured by visored helms, their halberds resting on the stone floor. From the shadows between the pillars stepped Hassan. He looked triumphant. "Lady Aisha," Hassan said smoothly, his voice echoing in the empty hall. Or, should I say, Princess Aisha al-Sharif. My blood ran cold, but I kept my face an emotionless mask. "I don't know what you are talking about, Prince Hassan." Hassan chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You have grown into a beautiful woman, but the eyes never change. The fiery, hateful eyes of the desert. I couldn't place you at the feast. But today, when you looked at my brother's broken body, the pieces fell into place." He stepped closer, flanked by his massive guards. "I remembered a diplomatic trip 10 years ago. Our father dragged us to Al-Hudud to intimidate your father. I was 15. Omar was 18. And Khalid. Khalid was 12. Hassan's smile grew cruel, lost in the memory. Khalid was always so quiet, so defiant. Omar and I decided to teach the bastard his place. We cornered him in your palace courtyard. We beat him with training swords. We beat him until the wood splintered, until his face ran with blood. A visceral shock hit me. The memory I had been grasping for finally snapped into focus. A sun-drenched marble courtyard, a boy, curled into a ball on the floor, absorbing horrific blows without making a single sound. And me, a 9-year-old girl in a sundress, running out from the balconies. "I remember," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Yes," Hassan hissed. "You ran out like a feral cat, a 9-year-old girl, screaming at us, threatening to have your father throw the princes of Izdihar in the dungeons. You threw yourself over his bleeding body. You were the only person in his entire miserable life to ever stand up for him." Hassan gestured to my face. "That is why he spared you. That is why the veiled viper was brought to his bed instead of the executioner's block. It's poetic, really, but it ends tonight." He turned to the captain of the guard. "Take her. Throw her in the deep dungeons. She murdered my brother, and I will have her confess to it before I take her head." The knights didn't move. Hassan frowned. "Did you hear me, Captain? Seize the assassin!" The captain of the guard slowly turned his head to look at Hassan. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stood there like a statue of iron. "They hear you, Hassan," a voice rumbled from the darkness behind me. I spun around. Khalid stepped into the moonlight. He wore his battle armor, the terrifying iron demon mask clasped firmly to his face. He looked like the god of death himself. "But they do not answer to you," Khalid finished. He raised a gauntleted hand. In perfect unison, the 12 elite knights turned their halberds away from me and leveled them directly at Hassan's chest. Hassan staggered back, his face draining of all color. "What is this? Treason! I am the heir to the throne. I command the royal guard." Khalid let out a low, terrifying laugh that vibrated off the stone walls. "You command the parade soldiers, brother, the fat lords who buy their commissions, but the elite? The men who actually bleed for Izdihar? Who do you think my father sent me to die with on the front lines for the last 6 years? Khalid walked slowly toward Hassan, the heavy clank of his boots sounding like a death knell. "I didn't just survive the wars you sent me to. I commanded them. I bled with these men. I saved their lives, and they saved mine. The military belongs to me." You planned this," Hassan stammered, backing up until he hit a pillar. "Omar's death was tragic," Khalid said coldly, "but yours will be a scandal. Evidence will be found in your chambers tomorrow. Letters detailing how you poisoned Omar to secure the throne for yourself, realizing father favored him. And when the guards came to arrest you, it will appear you fled into the night with as much gold from the treasury as you could carry." "No," Hassan shrieked. "Father will know. He will hunt you." "Take him," Khalid commanded the guards, "to the smugglers' caves on the coast. Lock him in with the stolen gold. Let him starve amidst the wealth he coveted so much." 2 massive knights grabbed Hassan, dragging him kicking and screaming into the shadows, silencing him with a brutal blow to the head. Silence fell over the corridor once more. I looked at Khalid. The demon mask stared back. Without a word, he reached up, unclasped it, and let it fall. His amber eyes found mine. They were burning with an intensity that took my breath away. He closed the distance between us, stopping only inches away. He reached out, his bare, calloused hand gently tracing the line of my jaw. "You remembered," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "The boy in the courtyard," I whispered, leaning into his touch instinctively. "I gave you the scar above your eye. I threw a ceramic pot at Hassan, but it shattered, and a shard hit you." A genuine, beautiful smile broke across his face. "You were terrible at aiming, but it was the bravest thing I had ever seen. I never forgot you, Aisha." He leaned down, and this time, there was no blade between us. He kissed me. It was desperate, fierce, and consuming, a collision of 2 survivors forged in fire. I wrapped my arms around his armored neck, pulling him closer, letting the taste of him, the heat of him, wash away the blood and shadows of the night. Chapter 8. The Pyre of the Sultan. 2 days later, the trap was set. The Sultan had returned in a fury, riding ahead of his main caravan with his personal, fanatically loyal Kingsguard. He had received word of Omar's death and Hassan's treasonous flight. He rode straight for the Grand Hall, demanding answers. I stood with Khalid on a high, hidden balcony overlooking the vast, domed banquet hall. The room below was set up for our grand wedding ceremony. Hundreds of figures sat at the tables. The Sultan burst through the heavy brass doors, flanked by 30 heavily armed guards. "Khalid!" the Sultan roared. He was an older man, his beard shot with gray, but his body was still thick with muscle and power. "Where are you, you useless bastard? Explain this madness." He stormed down the center aisle, but something made him pause. The room was utterly silent. The figures at the tables weren't moving. The Sultan reached out and grabbed the shoulder of a noble sitting near him. The figure toppled over. It was a dummy, stuffed with straw, dressed in fine silks. The entire room was filled with decoys. The Sultan froze. He flared his nostrils, inhaling deeply. "Naphtha," he whispered. "Out!" he screamed to his men. "It's a trap! Fall back!" The guards rushed the doors they had just entered, but as they hit the brass handles, heavy iron portcullises slammed down from the ceiling on all exits, sealing the room. From the balcony, Khalid raised a flaming torch. He looked down at the man who had sired him, the man who had murdered my family. There was no hesitation in his eyes. He dropped the torch. The naphtha, soaked into the rugs and the straw dummies, caught instantly. A roaring inferno exploded across the room, a sea of violent orange and red. The heat hit us like a physical blow. The Kingsguard screamed below, trapped in the burning cage. But the Sultan was not an ordinary man. He was a survivor. Seeing us on the balcony, he didn't panic. With surprising agility, he sprinted toward the wall, grabbed the heavy tapestry hanging there, and began to climb. The fire licked at his boots, but he pulled himself up, hauling his heavy body over the marble railing of our balcony, his scimitar already drawn. He was soot-stained and furious. "You!" he spat, glaring at Khalid. "I should have drowned you in a sack the day you were born." "You tried, father," Khalid said calmly, drawing his broadsword. "You just kept missing." The Sultan roared and charged. He was incredibly fast, his blows heavy and fueled by pure rage. Khalid met him blow for blow, the clash of steel ringing out over the roar of the fire below, but the Sultan fought dirty. He kicked Khalid's knee, throwing him off balance, and brought his sword down in a lethal arc. I didn't think, I acted. I drew my silver dagger and threw myself into the fray. I deflected the Sultan's killing blow, the impact jarring my arm to the shoulder. I spun, slashing at his unprotected flank. The Sultan roared in pain, stepping back. He looked at me, his eyes widening in recognition. "The Al-Sharif girl, you survived. To see you burn?" I hissed. Khalid recovered, and we attacked together. We fought in a deadly, beautiful synchrony, moving around each other without needing to speak. I was the viper, quick and distracting, landing shallow, bleeding cuts. Khalid was the iron, delivering brutal, heavy strikes that battered the Sultan's defenses. Finally, the Sultan tired. His parry was a fraction of a second too slow. Khalid's broadsword slipped past his guard, burying itself deep into the Sultan's chest. The old man gasped, his sword clattering to the floor. He dropped to his knees. Khalid pulled the sword free, the blood hissing as it hit the hot marble floor. He stood over his dying father, the flames from below casting demonic shadows across his face. Why? The Sultan choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. You take my throne. I don't care about your throne, Khalid said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He knelt down so he was eye level with the dying man. I remember the night my mother died. I was 5 years old. I hid in the closet. I watched you cut her throat, and the throat of the man she was married to, simply because you discovered I was your bastard. The Sultan's eyes widened in horror. You took me in, not out of love, but because I was a tarnish on your reputation, Khalid whispered, his words colder than ice. You sent a 14-year-old boy to the vanguard, hoping the enemy would do your dirty work. But I learned to be the monster you made me, and I brought that monster home. Khalid stood up. Burn in hell, father. I'll see you there eventually. We turned our backs on him, slipping out the balcony door into the cool night air as the grand hall finally collapsed into a roaring pyre, taking the tyrant of Izdihar with it. Chapter 9. The First Sultana. We stood on the highest tower of the palace, watching the dawn break over the desert. The sky was painted in bruised purples and brilliant golds. Below us, the city was waking up to chaos. Smoke plumed from the palace, but the military, Khalid's military, had already secured the streets. The deed was done. The nightmare was over. I looked at Khalid. The blood of his father was still on his armor, but the heavy weight that had always seemed to crush his shoulders was gone. He looked toward the eastern horizon. The day I escaped Al-Hudud, I said quietly, the wind whipping my hair. My father forced me into the escape tunnels because he received an anonymous note. I turned to him. It was you, wasn't it? Khalid finally looked at me, his amber eyes soft. I was a junior commander in the invading force. When I learned the target was Al-Hudud, I couldn't stop the army. I didn't have the power then. All I could do was send the warning. I rode into the city myself during the chaos, trying to find your palace, but you were already gone. Tears pricked my eyes. He had been trying to save the girl who saved him, even back then. What do we do now? I asked, looking out over the sprawling kingdom. The Sultan is dead. The heirs are gone. The throne is yours. Will you let it burn like you said? Khalid stepped closer, taking my hands in his. He lifted them, kissing my knuckles gently. He murmured, his voice a rich, vibrating hum. I only know how to destroy things. I am a weapon, Aisha. If I sit on that throne, I will only become my father again. I will rule with fear and iron. He looked deep into my eyes, and there was a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability there. But you, he said, his grip tightening, you know how to survive. You know how to care for people who have nothing. You lead the cinnamon birds not with fear but with love. You are the fire that builds, not the fire that consumes. He dropped to one knee on the cold stone, the Iron Prince, the monster of Izdihar, kneeling before a thief. Take the nation, Aisha, he said, looking up at me. I offer you Izdihar. Let the people of Al-Hudud return not as refugees, but as royalty. I will be your general. I will be your sword in the dark. I will be your husband, if you will have me. But you will rule. My breath hitched. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. I looked at the man I had sworn to kill, the man who had given me back my life, my people, and now an empire. The first female sultan of Izdihar, I whispered, the words tasting like victory. The sultana, Khalid corrected, a devastating smile breaking across his face. I reached down, tangling my hands in his dark hair, and pulled him up to his feet. I kissed him, sealing the bargain, sealing our fate, as the first rays of the sun hit the golden domes of our new kingdom. The end.
If you enjoyed this quick escape, hit the subscribe button for new stories twice a week. Until then, I'll see you at the next flip of the pages.